Yagli do. This is your Professor Adam Dunstan. If you have ever driven from Kenai Peninsula to Anchorage or vice versa, you have passed a place called Potter Marsh. That it may not be a name you recognize, but you will probably recognize the place if I tell you that it is the wetland pond-looking thing right before you get to the Anchorage sign, and that it oftentimes has people with big cameras or binoculars because it's good bird watching there. So that is Potter Marsh. However, long before it became named Potter Marsh in English, it was named Hukaditali, which means drift lumber. And it was a place that local Dena'ina people, from what we now think of as Anchorage, would come and gather up wood. So this place had names and significance and uses long before it became associated with Americans, and specifically a person by the name of Potter. So that's kind of a bit of an intro into what we'll be talking about today. Before we delve too much into future topics of history like colonialism and like INCSA and tribal law, I want to kind of cover what might life have looked like 300 to 400 years ago, i.e. before Russians and later Americans arrived on Alaskan soil. And of course, the answer is that a lot of things would have looked very, very different. And so in a way, this is a topic we'll cover many times throughout this course, but I kind of wanted to focus on it here as well, and specifically through the lens of those of us who live on Dena'ina Elnena, or Dena'ina country. And that would be most of the people that live on the peninsula, unless you're in places like Seward, and that would be most people that live, and that would be like Anchorage area, and that would be like Mat-Su Valley, all of those areas where I would say definitely the vast majority of our students are located, if they're located in state, are Dena'ina Elnena, Dena'ina country. So I want to talk about sort of, if you were to take a time machine 300 or 400 years ago, what would life have looked like? Now, in talking about this, we have to acknowledge that our knowledge of that time period is imperfect. We don't have a time machine, right? But we do have quite a bit of information from a variety of sources. Most importantly, the stories and knowledge and wisdom of elders and of oral storytelling and traditions where people pass along their history through the generations. As well, things like writings of anthropologists who went and spent time in these communities, in like the early 1900s. It's obviously not before Europeans had come, but oftentimes they were speaking to people that remembered what their own elders had told them. And so we can at least kind of understand what things would have been like in the early stages of colonialism, like in the 1800s. So this will be, and then we also have like the findings of archaeologists and what they've been able to find by excavations of abandoned villages. And so we kind of compile this information and we start to get a sense of what life might have looked like 300 or 400 years ago. And the answer, of course, is that it looks very different than what life looks like today. And talking about that, I think, is a powerful way of sort of storying our lands, by which I mean telling stories about our land that help us to better understand the present by better understanding the past. And with that in mind, I like to sometimes do this activity with people when I give community talks and stuff. I show them this picture and I say, what is this? And people will often say, oh, well, it looks like it might be like a caribou fur, maybe some pottery, because they're like, oh, you're an anthropologist, right? But what it actually is the upper cheekbone of, or more specifically, the upper left cheekbone of the Mona Lisa. And the reason that I bring that up is because if you're only looking at 5% of something, boy, can you really come away with a misunderstanding of the whole picture. And, we would never do that with something like the Mona Lisa, but the thing is, we do that sometimes with history. We look at the 5 or 10% of history, for example, that's happened since the 1750s, since Russian arrival into Alaska, and later American, or we look at, sort of 1860s on or 1870s on, right, American arrival. And those are incredibly important time periods where a ton of things happened. But there's also sort of this other 90% of history, thousands and thousands of years of things that were happening prior to that. And so if you only tell Alaska history and you only tell the last 100 or 200 years, you're really not seeing the full picture. So the idea of this lesson is let's kind of go further back, time machine it back and say, what would things have looked like before colonialism started? So our setting for this story is Tikatnu. Tikatnu is the name of Cook Inlet before it was called Cook Inlet. It's the Dena'ina name for Cook Inlet. Cook Inlet is named after Captain James Cook, the first English explorer to explore this part of Alaska. Captain James Cook, actually, as I understand it, never actually set foot in any of these lands, although he was in the inlet, and his boat experienced a lot of like bad conditions and stuff with like the I think it was like the boar tides that were messing him up. But point is, his ship was not doing well. He was generally miserable and kind of hated it. But they did go to Point Possession, if I'm remembering this correctly, and buried that bottle that says we claim this for England, and then promptly England did essentially nothing with it. It was instead land controlled by Russians, if anything. But anyways, point is, it eventually got the name Cook Inlet, which is a little ironic considering that Captain James Cook really did not care for his time in Alaska. But it was originally called Tikatnu, which is kind of translates into like really large, like river or like really large water. And then where I'm located in Kenai Peninsula would be known traditionally in Dena'ina as the Yaganen, which means like the good land. And of course, we might ask why the good land. Of course, this whole kind of South Central Alaska would be wonderful land to find yourself in 300 or 400 years ago, in part because of really, really abundant populations of salmon that come in from the ocean, bring all their protein and nutrients with them and swim up the river right to you. And of course, a number of other things as well. This doesn't exist nearly as much as it used to, but 200 years ago, much larger caribou presence in places like this, variety of different wildlife species, a very mountainous and beautiful land that is partly the result of two tectonic plates meeting and one subsiding into the other, and also partly the result of the glaciers receding about 10,000 years ago to closer to their current place, and then the land basically like lifting back up, kind of like what your house does after the snow is off. So anyways, all these different geological processes were going on and making a really beautiful landscape and a really diverse landscape that has a lot of different kinds of animals and plants. And so people could be doing things like living off of clams and living off of, like ocean resources, river resources like salmon, and also mountain resources like Dall sheep and like flatland resources like caribou. And that can all be like one community that's doing that. So very diverse environment, very diverse way of life, and a very rich way of life. And don't really need to talk about that. Well, actually, we have one. Now, I'm focusing on sort of 300 years ago, but we could take the story, of course, back much, much further than that. For example, where we are in Kenai, where I am located in Kenai Peninsula, people, as far as we can tell from archaeological sites and carbon dating, people appear to go back to about 8,000 BCE. There's reasons that we're not sure about that date, including that the carbon dating was done poorly on a specific site, but certainly people go back far before zero AD. And so, archaeology is a wonderful and amazing and also imperfect field because it's a little like a funnel. Most of what people did in the past will never reach an archaeologist doing research because it's been destroyed or covered with pavement or eroded into the ocean. But we do find some sites and data, and we're able to piece some things together. And this is kind of a map of Alaska as a whole over the years. BP means before present. So 1,300 years before present, 13,000 years before present would be basically just have to minus 2,000 to get it into the BCE numbers that most of us are used to. It's like 11,000 BC. But here in South Central Alaska, where'd it go? Oh, I don't know why it's not on this map. Well, here it is. Here in kind of South Central Alaska, and like Cook Inlet, Anchorage, Kenai Peninsula, things like that, you have a long time where you have this group of Paleo-Arctic people, as far as we can tell, which were using projectile points, and then Northern Archaic hunters, and then eventually a group that we call Riverine Kachemak, who were fascinating, and then eventually around 1000 AD, there's a shift from villages that are what we call Riverine Kachemak to Dena'ina. Now, no one knows for certain what happened to the Riverine Kachemak. There are certainly theories that, they went back to Kodiak Island, that the cultural tradition came up from Kodiak Island and then went back down, or that this community would have merged back into Yupik areas. Or perhaps not. Perhaps these communities developed new technology and shifted more to a way of life that we think of as like Dena'ina villages. But in any case, around 1000 AD, 700 to 1000, there's this major change, and suddenly we have the villages that we think of as sort of classic Dena'ina villages, the kind of villages that were here when Russians arrived, and some of those villages still exist to this day, and there's quite a few do not. This summarizes a lot of what I just said, so I won't overly hit the point. By the way, if you're in Kachemak Bay, if you're down in Homer, your timeline's a little bit different, including a group called the Marine Kachemak, and the fact that there was more presence of Alutiiq or Shukpiaq people in that area. Same thing, if you're out in Seward, that would have traditionally been Shukpiaq homelands. So these are kind of some of the tools from that 10,000 to 1,000 year period of Paleoarctic and Northern Archaic that we don't know a ton about. All of a sudden, you have the Riverine Kachemak group from 1000 BC to almost 1000 AD, more like 700. They're fascinating. Their villages, among other things, we can tell from the kinds of stones that you find at those sites that people were using them as weights, and that they were dragging most likely nets up the river with kayaks, or I should say down the river, doing drift net to catch salmon, and then depositing them at their sites and eating those salmon, and also using them for head cheese of fermented fish. So really fascinating sites, villages that may have housed as much as like 100 to 200 people in this example of a village that we call Kenai River Village. But in 1000 AD or CE, we have villages that are recognizably Dena'ina, that we look at and we say, yes, we can clearly assign that to like Dena'ina cultural practices. And like this looks like what the villages have looked like that we're aware of, more recent to the modern times. And some have presumed that what that means is that Dena'ina people moved from up here roughly and then down into Kenai Peninsula. And that sort of matches the oral history storytelling. But also there's a lot we don't know, and that's okay, right? This is something we're learning more about, and that may not be the most important question that we could ask, but we do know that Dena'ina people have been living on this land for an extremely long period of time. Now, that's one kind of archaeology way of telling the story. There are other ways of telling that story. If you read a book called The Dena'ina Legacy by Peter Kalfornsky, he tells a story called the Dena'ina clans, which among other things describes certain Dena'ina clans as how they came about. And it actually starts the story with a clan of people that came from the sky on a frozen cloud. Now, that of course is a way of telling the story that differs from how archaeologists would traditionally tell the story. But I'm not much of an archaeologist. I'm more of a cultural anthropologist. And in my opinion, I'm not here to arbitrate which version of the story is right or wrong. And indeed, some people, a lot of people feel like that you can blend those stories pretty well together. That sort of this overall narrative of coming south in that story matches with the kind of archaeology story. But in any case, there's more than one ways to tell that story. And in this class, I try to respect several different ways of telling that story. Why did I have that? Why did I have that? Oh, I think it just kind of, because, you're starting to lose attention at this point. So in any case, though, what was life like here, say in about 1700 AD? So that's what we'll talk about next.